Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to make a start. I begin today by acknowledging the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, traditional custodians of the land I'm on today in Marrickville, in Sydney's inner west, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Wherever we are, we're on country, and I extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the many different lands you are all on as we gather here virtually today. My name is Julie Sommerfeld, and I'm Manager of Rare Books and Special Collections at the University of Sydney Library. I wish you all a very warm welcome to the third event in a week of online talks to celebrate Sydney Rare Book Week. Rare Book Week began in Melbourne 10 years ago as a program of events associated with the book fair held by the Australian Association of Antiquarian Booksellers, or AMSAB. It's now an international movement. And although the in-person book fairs have been cancelled in Australia for this year, we really wanted to keep the tradition alive. So let's jump in. Today, we're getting up close and personal with an Australian icon recognisable the world over, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. For those of us living in Sydney, it's an everyday sight and we travel over it often by train, bus or car. But how much do we really know about the bridge? Why and how was it planned? Who built it? What were some of the social and political factors in play at Sydney at the time? What impact has it had on Sydney and the people living here? We have a panel of 4 speakers today to explore these issues. We're going to start off with some set questions, but there will be time at the end for your questions. And if you have any questions throughout today's session, pop them in using the chat or the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Let me now introduce our fantastic panel of experts. Annie Turnbull is up first. She's a curator at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, the Powerhouse Museum. Annie's expertise includes the social history of Sydney and New South Wales. This includes significant sites of Sydney, and in particular, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Annie aims to incorporate people's stories in museum and library collections and make them accessible through oral and video histories, exhibitions, web stories, and podcasts. From the University of Sydney, we have Dr. Sophie Loy-Wilson. Sophie is a senior lecturer in 20th century Australian history at the university. She specialises in immigration and labour history, and much of her work has documented the history of the Chinese Australian community in Australia. Erin Mollenhauer is the team leader, Library and Archives at the Donald Robinson Library at Moore Theological College, where she's worked since 2012. She's responsible for the Rare Book Collection and the Samuel Marsden Archives, a collecting archive which focuses on Anglicanism and evangelical Christianity. Dr. Cameron Logan, also at the University of Sydney, is an urban and architectural historian and director of the postgraduate program in heritage conservation at the university. Cameron is currently working on a book on the adaptive reuse of buildings, and he's developing a project about architecture and the urban crowd. He's the author of Historic Capital, Preservation, Race and Real Estate in Washington, DC, which was awarded the Society of Architectural Historians Antoinette Forrester Downing Book Award. He's co-editor of Fabrications, the journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand. So each of the various institutions represented by the speakers today hold some fascinating collections relating to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And throughout our discussions, they'll draw upon some examples from these collections, as well as some others to illustrate points under discussion. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. The first question is for Annie. Annie, I understand it took over 100 years for an agreement for the Sydney Harbour Bridge to be designed and built. Can you tell us about some of the factors that led to the bridge eventually being started in 1923?
Hi, thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. So I'm a self-acclaimed Pontist. because of my experience working on a series of podcasts and website at the State Library using their collection. But today I'll mainly be talking about the Powerhouse Museum's collection. So bridges symbolise a lot of things, and they symbolise connection, like the North and South Harbour being joined, and tension, the tension of the bridge staying upright, the tension to develop a bridge, who's going to pay for it, where's it going to go, and what's the design going to be. And also, I think the Sydney Harbour Bridge sort of became possible because of innovation and because of changes in materials and engineering. And I think it also is because of determination. And in the end, it was the determination of one man, JJC Bradfield, which we'll mention later. So, of course, Sydney Harbour is beautiful. As you come into it, you see the north and the south sides. And the Eora people, the people of the Eora Nation, used it as a fishing and trading site for over 60,000 years before the colonisers or before the colonial Australians arrived. So why did it take so long? It took 4 government bridge plan competitions. It took a plague, 4 public competitions, over 70 different designs. And it had been mooted pretty early on in the colony that a bridge would be a good idea. So in 1815, Francis Greenway, the former convict turned architect, had written a letter to the Australians saying a bridge would give an idea of strength and magnificence that would reflect credit and glory on the colony. And the image that you see here, and if I could have the next one too, Julie.
Oops, sorry.
Back a bit, thanks. Is of Sydney in about 1840, when it was starting to turn from a convict colony to more of a civic society. And I love this one in particular because it's actually from Flagstaff Hill, which is a Sydney Observatory. So there were actually designs. One of the first designs for a bridge over the harbour was in 1857 by Henderson, and this is in the library's collection. But before the bridge, there were 2 Sydneys. There was the North Shore, which in about 1860 had 300,000, and the South had 600,000 people. But by 1880, people could go to the North Shore via the 5 bridges of Pyrmont, Glebe, Iron Cove, Glazeville and Fig Tree. But in the early 1900s, and if I, next slide, please. In the early 1900s, there became an issue with the ferry services and the barges that were the main sort of entry across the harbour. So they ran at 1900, 75 ferries per hour. And in 1900, 13 million passengers a year. And by 1927, there were 27 million passengers a year. So you can see with the image on the bottom right, the overcrowding was an issue. And also sometimes it was quite dangerous. So there were different drivers for why a bridge would happen. And there were so the reason that, and if I could go to the next slide, I think that's me. Is that the last one? So it's always about politics. The questions were always the same. Who's going to pay for it? What kind of bridge is it going to be? And one of the major points of a bridge design was that it had to be big enough to let sea travel through. And the early designs couldn't cope with it. And the early materials couldn't cope with building an arch that went over 504 metres. And there were different designs of cantilevers, etc. Next speaker. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Annie. So Sophie's up next. Sophie, the bridge opened in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression. Can you tell us a bit about the economic and social impact of the bridge for the bridge workers and for the Sydney public throughout the 20s and into the 30s?
Thanks, Julie. Wonderful to be here. So I think for many of us, we associate the opening of the Harbour Bridge with the drama and the misery of the worldwide Great Depression, which of course, in the popular mindset, begins with the Wall Street crash in 1929. And historians call this Great Depression the most momentous economic event of the 20th century, and it still carries, I think, that title. So for the workers that would have been involved with this massive engineering feat of engineering, the Sydney Harbour Bridge and its build, Important to emphasize that Australia's Great Depression was a little different to Great Depressions around the world, such as the one experienced in America. Now, this is because Australia's Great Depression had really begun in 1927. So Australia had a diversified agricultural economy. This was because our Prime Minister in the 20s, Stanley Melbourne Groot, who was very proud man of empire, had introduced a policy that saw Australia being the primary producer of agricultural goods for the British Empire. This policy was called Men, Money and Markets, and it saw Bruce in the mid-1920s under soldier settlement schemes, really encouraging farmers, particularly wheat farmers, to grow very, very large crops to sell to the UK. Now, the problem is, by the late 20s, agricultural prices had plummeted for things like wheat and dairy. And this left many of our soldier settlers and many farmers around Australia exposed economically. And it led to a lot of human misery, and it led to a large amount of migration from rural to urban areas. So already by 1927, you have a very large population of itinerant men and women looking for work in Sydney. And many of those men and women found work as part of the Sydney Harbour Bridge build, really hard work. As you see here, this is an image of some of the shanty towns that we popularly associate with this time. This one's from a bit later, but we know there were shanty towns popping up in the late 1920s in Sydney, in places like La Perouse, in the infamous Happy Valley camp, for example. So you would have been seeing a lot of poverty around Sydney by the late 1920s by way of kind of itinerant camps like the one I've pictured here. So I can imagine that some of the workers would have been moving between these camps or pretty insecure housing to go and work on the bridge. Now, I just want to move forward to one more slide. Thanks, Julie. Just next slide. Great. So one of the many, many riches of the Sydney University Rare Books collection is these incredible albums that JCC Bradfield kept while he was in charge of the Harbour Bridge build. And the reason I wanted to bring them up in response to this question is they, on the one hand, document this incredible feat of engineering in all its majesty, but they also document the social history of the men and women working on the build. So just next slide. Thanks, Julie. So here we have the steel being melted for the bridge. And if you look up close, you can see kind of the men and the working conditions involved in the steel production for the bridge. Next slide. Thanks, Julie. Here we have an incredible photograph, I think, of just how deep they had to excavate, you know, for this bridge. And they dug really deep into the sandstone. It was really hard labor. And they documented, Bradfield documented every stage of this excavation. And while they're doing this excavation, some really interesting things happen. Next slide, thanks, Julie. Okay, so you can see here the extent of the excavation and the wall going up for the bridge. Next slide, thanks, Julie. This is a close-up of the men. You can see them, how deep and how small they are in relation to the excavation. Next slide, great. So while they're doing this, they come across these incredible convict bricks that they, you know, photograph and document. So it's sort of old Sydney being kind of up against new Sydney, right? As the bridge is emerging, kind of reminders of Australia's past emerge from the sandstone. Next slide, thanks, Julie. Now, important to emphasize that the bridge creates work not just in Sydney, but also beyond Sydney as well. It creates work for steelworkers in Newcastle. It also creates work for a very interesting community of people in Moruya. And here we have the Moruya Quarry, which was responsible for supplying a lot of the stone for the bridge, the stone that we see on the bridge today. Just next slide, thanks, Julie. And here we have what's called Granite Town. So this is a town that emerges just around the Moruya Quarry, so just to service it. And you can imagine that for many of the people that had been, you know, had to leave their farms because they'd been made bankrupt by the huge plummet in agricultural prices, this would have been a bit of a refuge. So last slide, thanks, Julie. So I think this slide exemplifies to me, some of the really interesting ways in which the Bradfield album can be used. So we can see here this community documented around the Maria Granite Town, and very, very interesting to think about what their lives might have been like while the Harbour Bridge is being built in Sydney. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Sophie. Erin, a unique collection of photographs of and about the bridge taken by Frank Cash is held at Moore Theological College. Who was Frank Cash, and what's the significance of these photographs?
Yeah, thanks, Julie, and good afternoon, everyone. So it's a little bit surprising that a theological college would hold a collection of photographs of the Harbour Bridge, but it's because Frank Cash, who took the photographs, he was an Anglican clergyman, and he was the rector of Christ Church in Lavender Bay from 1922 to 1961. He was also the registrar of the Australian College of Theology and a canon of St Andrew's Cathedral. But it was just a wonderful combination of circumstances that the clergyman in that parish at the time that the bridge was being built was also a talented amateur photographer. And so his collection, which is held at Moore College, contains his camera. It's an Adams Minex camera. We also have his lantern slide projector and his extensive photographic collection of glass plate negatives, positive prints, film negatives, and glass lantern slides that he had produced himself from his negatives. In 1930, he produced a book called Parables of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which features many of his images, and he uses different aspects of the bridge's construction as a sort of metaphor for God's work in the world. Next slide, please. So Cash had become friends with Bradfield, and he asked Bradfield for permission to go onto the construction site, and Bradfield said no. And apparently this caused a bit of a rift between them. And so then Cash went to Dawn and Long Company, and they said yes. He has permission to take photographs, as it says there. And so he had otherwise no connection with the construction work, but he managed to get permission to go onto the construction site, into the workshops, right up onto the arch, and he took some extraordinary photographs of the bridge being built. But a really unique aspect of his photographic collection were the photographs that he took of houses in the Lavender Bay, Milsons Point area being demolished in the 1920s to make way for the bridge. And so he's documenting the effect that this has on the community. Next slide, please. So this is from November 1926, a house in Arthur Street, North Sydney, which he's captured on the way down to the ground. He describes the effect on his community in his parish paper that he wrote for Christ Church, Lavender Bay. In December 1926, he wrote, "How much more speedy is the pulling down of a house than the building up of it." Next slide, please. So this was a series of terrace houses opposite the town hall in North Sydney, and he describes it in his book as all three walls being pushed down in a domino effect from one blow to the right-hand wall. Next slide, please. The terrace houses in Burton Street. In August 1927, he writes in the parish paper that the parishioners of his church have been reduced by 200 people in the previous 2 years. And in total, more than 500 homes, businesses, shops and pubs were demolished in the Milsons Point area, with 3,000 people being uprooted. Next slide. So we don't know exactly where. He didn't always document the address, but that's another house in the process of demolition. And next slide. This one shows the workmen right up on the top chimney with no scaffolding. And the next one is similar. Thanks, Julie. There they are up on a wall. In September 1927, he writes, "A vastly changed scene is being prepared to take the place of pleasant homes in which not so long ago dwelt many people who loved and helped and worshipped in our own church. Now they have all gone." And that's a wall of terrace houses in Milsons Point. And you can see the communal chimney structure. And the next one is the last one. That's another wall all the way down. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Erin. Cameron, can you tell us about Bradfield and his role in building the bridge?
Thanks, Julie. And hi, everyone. I'm coming from Bidjigal land, which is in Elwood between the Walleye Creek and the Cooks River. Yeah, look, Bradfield, you know, he's the name associated with the bridge. We always hear Bradfield and the bridge, but in many ways, what Bradfield did wasn't design this as such. As you know, as Erin just alluded to, Dorman and Long are the sort of contractors, and I guess they're responsible for the civil works, as I understand it, for the actual and the structural design. Although Bradfield's involved in the discussions, what Bradfield's really doing is designing a whole system of transportation for Sydney, and he's trying to knit together a modernised system of railway and road. And so, you know, that's, I suppose, in a sense, he's the sort of master planner of the situation and not the designer of the structure as such. Nevertheless, if you look at the next image that I've put on the slides here, he associates himself very closely visually with the bridge. He's very keen to have himself set as sort of involved in the kind of heroic aspect of the bridge itself as structure. And here is this Harold Casno photograph of him, not from our collections, but from the National Library, standing beside this the so-called kingpin, that great linchpin of the structure. And the same, and I was very pleased to see in the other in the folios, the Rare Books Bradfield collection that he took himself, that he also put a lot of emphasis on this element. If you go on to the next slide, you can see that his crew, if you like, the officers associated with the delivery of the project, also photographed, you know, aligning themselves with this linchpin element of the bridge. So I suppose what we learn about him, what we know about him in a sense, is he's this taking responsibility for the broad picture of what's going on, but he really wants to align himself too with the sort of materiality and the sort of heroic dimensions of the bridge in terms of its construction. And you know, there's a wider set of photographs, but that the bridge itself, including the towers, you know, that's really designed by other people, including, you know, English architects Bernard Tate and Lorne, and including, you know, the famous approach towers, which were, you know, not, you know, required in a sense for the structure. So yeah, so it's a curious role that he plays as both, you know, the wider mastermind, but then he's very deliberately conscious of publicity, seemingly, to insert himself into the story of the bridge itself and to become, and he would have been aware just how important this process of constructing it had become to the city, and to really make sure he was aligning himself very closely with its sort of physical presence and meaning in the city.
Thanks, Cameron. Annie, we're back to you. The Sydney Harbour Bridge is nicknamed the coat hanger after its very distinctive shape. What can you tell us about its design?
Thanks, Thanks, Julie. I wanted to link back to Erin, though. These, just because the museum collects material from buildings, as well as tested material that's tested, but these knockers are from houses that were demolished in the rocks in the 1930s as part of the construction of the bridge and the support structures for the bridge and the roadways. So the one on the right is from a wealthy house, and I think there were 500 houses that were demolished on the north and south side of the bridge, and 400 families were displaced. And I know that the people who were renters got no recompense, and those who were landowners got a small recompense. But as with any major infrastructure, there is destruction as well as creation. So I also just wanted to say that it took 8 years for the bridge to be built, and 1,400 labourers worked on the bridge. And the design of the bridge, well, as Cameron has said, the pylons were not part of the original design, but Bradfield went overseas in just after World War I in 1922, and he was looking at bridges around the world. He happened to cross the Hellgate Bridge in New York, which didn't have pylons, but he was inspired by the fact that the steel arch could cross that river, and perhaps the steel was the right, the manufacturing of steel had changed, it was a bit lighter, and it would be possible to have an arch bridge in Sydney, not a cantilever or earlier designs that were proposed. So it would allow shipping through, which is another point. So next slide, please, Julie. So we've got a fantastic collection from Public Works, New South Wales Public Works. We've got about 190 shots of the bridge being built. So I think what was also interesting was Sydney siders had been waiting a long time for a bridge. And when something this large started being created in Sydney, they watched it every day. They couldn't help but see it from the ferry or from the side of the harbour. And so when the bridge was built, the two arches joined. Another slide, please, Julie. When the two bridges, they came together after 2 years. The archway was the first part of the bridge to be built. And I must say that there were very big Dorman and Long work spaces on the north and the south side of the harbour, and where a lot of the employees worked. So you can see that the ship going out. Our next slide, please. I love how they're so casual at a very, very high place with no safety gear whatsoever. And I think the people in the suits were the managers, and you can see the workers just had the cap and the trousers and top, and there was no particular clothing that they wore at the time. Next image, please. This is all from our collection. So the image on the left I really like, because it was such an event that was happening. There were artists and there were photographers who were documenting this occurrence. So there was Sam Hood, Harold Casno, pretty well any artist who could pick up a paintbrush was also documenting. So that's a photographer photographing the construction of the pylons. And on the other side is the workers cleaning the pylons towards the end of the construction. So I do have to say I've learned a beautiful phrase called the turning of the sod, which is when the building of the bridge began on the 28th of July 1923 on the North Shore. We should reintroduce that phrase in any way that we can. So next slide, please.
Okay, so we're back to Cameron. And Cameron, what physical effect has the bridge had on the city of Sydney?
Yeah, well, I guess, myriad, I suppose, Julie, but I don't intend to try and speak to all of them. The one, I guess, that's pretty obvious when you think about this spatially from the point of view, thinking maybe more as a designer or engineer, it's what this immense structure does is it really rationalizes space and movement in the city. So that, as I alluded to, the fact that the design before was about connecting the railroad to the north directly without having to get off and take a ferry and go across, and likewise the road. And as people know who have travelled across it, of course, you come out from underground only a few hundred metres back. So what that whole process is doing is sort of rationalising movement across a very undulating landscape and allowing rapid movement across that landscape. And so that does two things. Well, firstly, it smooths out and makes it easier to travel around. And so the bridge, so there's this immense physical infrastructure put into achieving that. And if we look at the other picture, it emphasises in a sense the same things that that Annie was just showing when she was talking. There's this immense physical infrastructure there to create this smoothness. The other thing the bridge does, and that rationalisation achieves, is it opens up the North Shore. It connects the North Shore to the rest of the city, much more closely, and therefore the bridge is really a sort of real estate machine in a lot of ways. It makes real estate because it reduces time, and so it reduces travel time and it allows workers and I suppose in a sense capital to flow much more easily between the two parts of the city, and therefore it in this sense it also is a system for speeding settlement and increasing the density and scope of settlement in the city. So it's really doing two things. It's an immense piece of infrastructure, but it's also a kind of machine for settling the city ever more intensely. And so it's a way in which the bridge actually works to increase the size of the city, increase the population of the city and its potential as a metro area, and therefore I suppose to intensify the settler society's grip on this very key location in terms of the whole continent too.
I wonder if the designers could have realised just how much and how quickly the population would grow. Annie, the construction of the bridge took many years, and you've touched on this already, but what did that mean for the people involved in building it and the people of Sydney watching it appear on the skyline?
And I'm just going to show you a series of objects from our collection that are about the testing of the materials during the building of the bridge, because there was a lot of testing. I think one of my favourite stories, as I mentioned, it took 2 years for the arches to come together. And one of my favourite stories is that some of the people looking at these arches started to feel very, very sorry for the horses and carts that would have to travel across the arch to get to the other side of the harbour, because the roadway was not put in at that point. So that, I think, is quite delightful. I just wanted to touch on this, if you could go to the next one. So these are the rivets that were used on the bridge. So there were 1,400 workers in Sydney. There were 250 at Moruya. 16 people died, 2 at Moruya at the quarries. There are a lot of Scottish workers at the quarries in Moruya. There was one man who survived when he fell off the bridge. So quite remarkable. When you look at the safety, I'm amazed more people didn't actually perish working on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The museum collects in applied arts and engineering, and that's a granite sample from Moruya, which is fantastic, and a couple of the testing beams on the right-hand side from our store. And next slide, please. So as we've seen a bit, now the chap in the hat, I've only seen one photo with Bradfield without a hat, but that's Bradfield as he inspects part of the building of the Harbour Bridge. So there was intense interest throughout Sydney during the 8 years of the construction of the bridge. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, testing was an ongoing part of this. They wanted to make sure it was safe. So you can see these trains, and this is when the roadway was put across the bridge, and the trains were used to test if the bridge would actually carry the load. So it must have been a very brave or confident train driver who drove these across the railway line. It was also testing the track. Next one, please. Again, another photograph. It's interesting how they have similar photographs. There's a couple of women there. The one, I think, to the right of Bradfield, who hasn't got a hat on, is his wife, looking quite happy compared to other images I've seen of her. Because from what I've read, he worked very, very long hours and he lived on the North Shore in Gordon. And then I think the one on the left is his secretary, Eileen Bowker, whose archive we have in the museum's collection. Next one, please. So this is a fantastic document, and I think it proves that Bradfield was very aware of the need for publicity and to work with the politicians and the media. So he did radio announcements, and Eileen typed up each of these announcements, and this is a book of about 40 of the announcements as part of her archive. So I think he was very clever. He kept trying to press the newspapers Apparently that backfired at one point when he went to the regional newspapers trying to get support for the bridge, promoting it, and they were worried all the money was going to be spent in the city and not in the country. Anyway, that's me, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question's for Sophie. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and the planning and construction of the bridge is no exception. What was happening in the political context and social at the time, more broadly?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Well, you really couldn't get a more dramatic or volatile time than, the time period of the 1920s and then, after the opening of the bridge, in 1932. And I'll just speak to two aspects quickly. The first is the political aspect of all of this. And to illustrate, the kind of extent of the political divisions that are being experienced in Australia at this time, I wanted to kind of give you two figures. One is that the first figure is that Australia's public debt to Great Britain grew from £360 million in 1920 to £595 million in 1929. Okay, and much of this money is raised by British bondholders in London. So you can see how exposed Australia was to economic crisis in the early days of the Great Depression. Now, the second figure relates to this, and that is the unemployment figure in Australia around the period of the Great Depression. So in 1931, scholars disagree, but many estimate that Australia's unemployment rate was between 29% and 30% of the population at that time. So second only to Germany in terms of the degree of unemployment in our country during the Great Depression. So as you can imagine, there is extreme political unrest that emerges because of this situation. Here we have a very famous photograph of an eviction that happens in Newtown during the Great Depression of a family. And these are the kind of sites that you would have seen around the city at this time. People did a lot of night flits, which meant they kind of just fled their landlords at night to avoid, paying rent. And they moved to unemployment camps in places like, La Perouse, Frog Hollow, and Happy Valley. Now, that's one aspect of this. The other aspect of this is that politically, you have a huge shift in kind of the political leadership of the country. In 1929, the very unpopular Bruce government is voted out, and the Labor Scullin government comes in with this poison chalice of the Great Depression. And very quickly, they're told by bondholders in the UK, pay back the money that you owe on this huge debt to the UK. And people are very aware of this. They're reading newspapers. They're very aware that there's this pressure to repay the money while there is human misery on the streets and huge unemployment. A thing called the Premier's Plan is put together when a man called Sir Otto Niemeyer visits Australia, who is, the kind of figurehead of the British bondholders to get the debt back. And this is a really brutal plan that suggests, among many things, a 20% reduction in wages for all public servants immediately. So really dire times in the city. So people quickly translate their grievance into political action. When Scullin, the Labor leader, proves pretty ineffective, they turn their attention to J.T. Lang, who, of course, as many of you will know, and as Annie will talk about, plays a very key role in the history of the Harbour Bridge. And Lang becomes the working man's hero at this moment because he says we're not going to pay back the British bondholders at this time. They need to show mercy to us. He stresses the immorality of this plan to pay back the bondholders, and he proposes a separate plan called the Lang Plan, which means that New South Wales alone amongst all the states in Australia is not going to pay back the money to the British bondholders. And in fact, we default on these repayments. And at one point, in fact, to protect the money of New South Wales, Lang takes $400,000 from the Commercial Bank of Sydney and he puts it in a different place, and he has armed guards protecting the money from the federal government coming in and taking it. All right. This is in 1931, 1932. So things are really dire. And you also have really extreme political views around this. So people who support Lang are moving further to the left. And people who don't support Lang are moving further towards the right to fascism and to the New Guard. So this is the political context in which the Harbour Bridge is opened in 1932.
Thanks, Sophie. Hey, back to Cameron. So building a structure like the Sydney Harbour Bridge was on a scale completely new to Sydney at the time. Today, it's just one of many massive structures on the skyline. So what does that say about how Sydney has changed and the changing relationship of the bridge to the city?
Yeah, well, there's a wide question there. I'm not sure I'll be able to address it all with what I want to say, but I guess what Sophie's alluding to there in some respects is the dependence of Australia on sources of international capital to get a project like this done. And Australia, through much of the 20th century, depended for big projects on foreign sources of capital, and that was usually Britain, but increasingly also the United States and other places. But what you have, I suppose, with the bridge here is something of a scope that just hadn't been done before, and you have this, as Annie was talking about before, this amazing interest in the size really of the project, and people just observing on a daily basis what was going on with this sort of, there was a sense almost, of it as a great sort of spectacle, almost a sort of sublime, urban sublime. We're familiar with this sort of natural sublime of sort of 18th or early 19th century paintings of people looking at this immense nature and almost being overwhelmed by it. But there's a sense in which infrastructure did the same thing in 19th and then into the 20th century in cities, in big cities like New York. And for Sydney, I think this is probably the first real experience of that, where the scale of what we could build ourselves was sort of immense and almost overwhelming. And people were obsessed with it. If you look at the next picture, in some ways, both these pictures highlight that, but especially this one. And Annie alluded before to that, the sense where the arch was joined, or that sprung out from the two sides and then eventually joined, and then the deck was hung from this arch. And so people watched this, I guess, somewhat awestruck, and people would come to the jetties and whatever just to watch the daily work. So it's a really amazing event in the life of the city. You think, oh, it's a construction project, but this is one that's, it's spectacular and sublime in its scale. And I think for that reason, it becomes such an important thing, because it's already really important, almost in process, not just when it's built. What we've built since, arguably just hasn't captured the imagination the same way. Things are immense often, but the sense that they are public and that they're shared and that we all, in some ways, belong to them. And I alluded before the fact that this is a sort of real estate machine, but I think I guess my colleague in the City Councillor, Philip Ballas, would say this is exemplary public Sydney. It is a public project that people engage with and feel some sense of ownership over. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit about that in terms of the way that flowed into the opening of the bridge as well. But I think that is what distinguishes itself, that sense of ownership, from perhaps what comes later in the sense of just tall buildings and the development of the city. And there are many interesting and wonderful projects, and not least, of course, the Opera House. But a lot of the big things don't have that same impact on people's sense of what the city is and their sense of connection to it.
Thanks, Cameron. Annie, the long-awaited opening of the bridge was a very significant event, and Sydneysiders flocked to it. Allegedly, over half the population of Sydney attended the opening ceremony. There were some iconic moments. Can you tell us a bit more about some of them?
Yeah, sure. If you could, next slide, please, Julie. So, and also to Sophie's point, yeah, it was an icon of hope, actually, for people living through a really tough time of a depression. And so it's meant to have been 1 million people have attended the opening. And there were a number of events developed for that opening. You can see the ship and the other small boats there on the opening day on the 19th of March. There was a Children's Day on the 16th of March where school kids paraded across. There were multiple parades. Our next image, please, Julie. Multiple parades across the bridge, and a colleague of mine, Vanessa, researched this boomerang that we have in our collection. There were floats of representing agriculture and representing achievements. And there was actually a float of Indigenous people as well. And this particular one was made by the Sims family from La Perouse. And there was an Aboriginal contingent amongst the Boer War veterans who paraded across on the day as well. And what was interesting, and I don't have a photo of the back, but there was a fantastic story of a young lad called Lenny, who was 9, who rode his horse, Ginger Mick, 1,000 kilometres from Gippsland to attend the opening. It took him months. I don't know what any parent was thinking. It took him 4 months to actually ride across from Gippsland to come to the opening. But we've got his signature on the back of this boomerang. So Vanessa's doing a bit more research. Next image, please. This is also pretty awesome. And this alludes to the political conflict that had been building, and then the opening was when it really erupted. But we have this microphone, and it's signed by a few of the players like Bradfield, Sir Philip Game, who represented the Queen at that time, and also Enos, who was the unlucky engineer who worked for Dorman Long and never really got a lot of credit. So next image, please. This is one of my favourite photographs. It's you can see one policeman with a flat hat attached to a man, and another man with a kind of pork pie-ish hat on the other side. So this is the arrest of Francis de Groot, who was a member of the paramilitary right-wing group, the New Guard. So they were very, very annoyed at Jack Lang, our state Premier, because he really didn't want a representative of the Queen to come to the opening. He didn't want New South Wales to pay for it. And so he didn't invite anyone, and Philip Game was the one that came in. But the New Guard were increasingly worried about this, red, right, left-wing kind of state Premier, and had planned some sort of action for the opening. So just as the ribbon was about to be cut with the scissors, Francis de Groot, on a borrowed horse, with his sword from the Boer War, slashed the ribbon and declared the Harbour Bridge open for the free men of New South Wales. So he was then arrested, dragged off the horse, fined a certain amount, but later got off the £5 fine. So fantastic that we've got Elaine Bowker's photograph of him being arrested. It's just remarkable. Anyway, next image, please. So we have other material within it. There were many different events for the day, and this is the official opening that Elaine was invited to as Bradfield's secretary, and that's the tickets. Okay, I think that's me for this, yes?
Yes, thanks. Cameron, if we're still thinking about the bridge opening, what does it have to tell us about the kinds of events that attract crowds in Sydney and the concept of modernisation for the city?
Sorry, the oldest problem in the book there with Zoom. Look, the question about the crowd is really interesting, and what Annie's mentioned about the size of it and just what an immense event it was for Sydney at the time. And I was curious before she was alluded to the turning of the sod. There's a long tradition in a way in the colonies of infrastructure openings becoming big events and big public events. And, I mentioned before this idea of the bridge as its connection between infrastructure and land, and this being key to the kind of settlement process in a way. But there's a sort of third element to that, which is the population and their kind of the legitimacy and the sense of engagement with the process and the sense of them celebrating at some level progress. So if you go all the way back to 1850, there's a wonderful print in the State Library of New South Wales of an artwork of the turning of the sod, as it was, and that's the name of the painting for the first railway in Sydney. So it's people turning out to Redfern, where the original terminus of the railway was, to observe in a very large crowd for the city in 1850 the opening of that. And of course, in the Bradfield folios in our rare books is also a series of photographs of that initial event, which was a large crowd event in itself, like 7 years, or I'm not sure what was the year again, 24 or 25, when they had that event. So there's a way in which the city, the population of the city, wanted to come out and witness the event itself. And sorry, I should have given you or found a better crowd slide. There are a number of fantastic images, none from the actual Bradfield folios themselves, but there are lots of great images of those crowds, and it was an immense crowd on the day of the actual opening. So it's really about them witnessing and participating in a sense, this event, a marker of progress too for the colony and for the nation.
Thanks, Erin. Annie, if we think about the years since the opening, the bridge, along with the Sydney Opera House and Luna Park, has evolved to stand as a very significant cultural icon, recognisable worldwide. Tell us about the bridge as a focal point for celebration, for fashion, photography and art over the decades.
Sure. Next image, please, Julie. So there was a lot of, starting with the opening of the bridge in 1932, there was actually a lot of memorabilia produced. I really like this heater. So there were teaspoons and postage stamps. So the iconography of the bridge as a major tourism and symbol of Sydney, New South Wales and Australia started in 1932 with its opening. Next image, please, Julie. So we also have these fantastic shell harbour bridges from the La Perouse community as well. So next image, please. So it didn't take long for artists who were documenting the the building to start documenting the artwork. So this is Peter Kingston on the left. And of course, when we had the Sydney Olympics, the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House became part of the iconography, part of the parades of the 2000 Sydney Olympics. But the bridge has been used for a number of protests and celebrations. The fireworks that were used for the opening in 1932 was the first time. And you know that we still use them and are the first city around the world to have fireworks on New Year's Eve. Next image, please. Fashion has also been attracted. I think most people will recognise Ken Doan on the left with his rather natty vest with the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House. And then, of course, Jenny Key and Linda Jackson using it in their clothing that they sold in Flamingo Park. Next image, please. David Mist, we've got a fantastic collection of his fashion photography. And this ad is for Telstra, and it's got the Harbour Bridge spot on in the background. And next image, please. And what I particularly like is artworks and lace and textiles that are really fragile, that still manage to capture the strength and the heaviness and the beauty of the arches of the bridge. So I don't think the bridge will stop being used as a symbol for tourism and as a symbol for success in infrastructure in Australia. And I just really like this one by Alice Vocat because it's just captures that early use of the bridge. I'm sure there's more to say, but I'm sure others have questions. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Annie. So last set question for the day, and then we're going to open up to some audience questions. Cameron, how do you think the bridge fits into the landscape of Sydney today?
Oh, yeah, it's a tough one. It remains central. I think Annie's just highlighted the fact that it remains central to the inhabitants of the city as a way of identifying that you're there, and it remains central to those who are from elsewhere who can identify the city through the bridge, and obviously the Opera House, and often as an ensemble photograph. But it's really, I think, testament that it's been able to maintain its sense of monumental presence. That people want to come to Sydney, they want to, when my family and a lot of my friends are from Melbourne, when they come, they bring their kids, they want to touch the bridge. Sometimes the Opera House as well. It's very interesting. It's almost then they've really been there to the city. And also when you approach it, it maintains, despite the fact that the city's grown up around it. We have really large buildings, including one rather immense one sitting out on a promontory that's just been constructed. Nearby, this remains the sort of thing that your vision draws you towards. And I found really compelling something I read recently, and do a little plug for a different event I'm involved in next week, which is a Sydney Open event, talking about what's it called, the DNA of Sydney. And one of the other panelists in that, Vanessa Berry, wrote a book called Mirror Sydney, which I read recently because I was going to be involved in this panel. And it's a wonderful book, and it finishes with this amazing scene of her and her partner taking the bridge that crosses the bridge at midnight. And this sense that no one can really see them because they're in an almost empty train carriage, but the whole city sort of indeed the nation, and perhaps many parts of the world as well, have their eyes on that particular moment, it remains central in that way, and it's really beautifully evoked by her in that little piece in the book. And I think it really highlights just that the continuing role it has to identify the city immediately.
That's great, thanks. Well, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and let's open up to audience questions. I have one here for Sophie. So Sydney Uni building workers lived in Newtown. Locomotive and carriage works, Everleigh workers lived in Redfern, Everleigh. Where did the Sydney Harbour Bridge workers live?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I don't know the full answer from the research I've done on this. They came really from all over. You had every union in Sydney involved in this, and many people were sort of would congregate at Trades Hall and then go down to the bridge from there, Trades Hall and Haymarket. There's a number of really important strikes over conditions and pay involving the bridge, from iron workers, from stone workers, from a whole range of individuals. They're striking over wages mostly, and they're going to the arbitration court. And it's really interesting because Justice Beebe at the arbitration court says in 1929 that he calculates their pay based on what workers got building a bridge in New York. So he sort of looked at a similar bridge in New York and said, that's how we're going to calculate, your pay. And the workers were saying that the safety issues were worse on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, so they should be paid more. So there's actually a really interesting dialogue between the workers. And what I got from that was that sort of every union in Sydney gets involved to kind of help and show solidarity with the workers via Trades Hall. So I can't tell you precisely where they all came from, but it seems to me that the working people of Sydney via the unions were all kind of involved in this big arbitration battle to get wages increased, and they do get wages increased marginally in 1931.
Thanks, Sophie. So we have an interesting question here. Would the audience at the opening ceremony have known what de Groot's protest was about at the time?
I don't think, from what I've read, I don't think many people saw it because it was high up on the bridge, and even some of the dignitaries didn't see it. So no, but those that were members of the New Guard would know what it was about, and they had been kind of muttering and working together to do some sort of interception, because the New Guard were they're quite fascinating when you look back at them. They had maps dividing all of New South Wales into areas that they would look after, and they had military names for their organisation, and certain groups would take care of a section of New South Wales, section of Sydney, if the communists took over. So it was they were very kind of really were paramilitary, but no, it was only later, I think, when it was reported in the press that people were aware.
Okay, thanks. One of our audience members is asking, to what extent did the bridge reinforce or negate the idea of the North Shore as the suburbs of the upper class? I'll throw that open to whoever wants to go at that one.
Well, it made it more accessible, certainly. And, the working class would have lived closer to their work, so they wouldn't have to pay a lot in transport. They wouldn't have had access to cars. Very few people had cars in the 1930s, only the very wealthy. But I think Cameron can probably say something about real estate values, because it certainly did open up the North Shore to more, this train line up to more suburbs being opened up.
Yeah, I can't answer that with any certainty, but in terms of perception, but yeah, clearly, I think it reinforced the idea of the sort of stockbroker belt in Upper North Shore. That type of idea is really reinforced and becomes perhaps more accessible to a wider group of that same social class, if you like. But I don't know for certain in terms of if you're just talking about how people perceived it in the 1930s. That's a little bit above my pay grade.
Someone's asking about their Scottish great uncle was a painter on the bridge from construction to 1954. He's in a photo in the Pylon Museum. Is there any more information anywhere about the painters?
I don't know. I mean, look, there's certainly, there was a museum at the Bridge Museum that they might know, the people running that. Also, there's a series of interviews, oral histories done with some of the workers on the bridge that was done in the 1980s by Richard Braxworthy. That's in the State Library collection called Bridge Builders, funnily enough. It might be somewhere. State Government Archives might have a listing of workers.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there too. Like, I think the arbitration court records at the State Archives should have lists of names potentially organised by union. That might be a place to find some information.
Paul Hogan was one, wasn't he? He might fund something for it.
That's right. We're at time, but if people like to stick around, we might sneak in one or two more questions. But if you have to leave, we understand. Thank you very much for joining us. So the next question is, how would the granite from Moria have been transported to Sydney? Was it by ship, by train?
The 3 ships that were specially built to transport it up to Sydney, is my understanding. Sophie?
Yeah, no, there's great photographs in the Bradfield album of this, right? So of the granite being loaded onto the ships and transported to Sydney. So I think you're totally right, Annie. That's how it got transported.
Hey, how much did it cost to build the bridge?
Oh, I've got that somewhere. A lot. And it took us until 1988 to pay it back. And that was the initial reason for the tokens on the bridge. But you'll notice that we keep paying for crossing the bridge, but that's to update the maintenance, because it never stops. The work on the bridge never, ever stops. I'll have to look that up.
We might just have a couple more. So this question is for Erin. The Reverend Cash lamented the bringing down of the houses of Milson's Point and North Sydney. Is there any record of the churches involved in advocating for those people evicted for the bridge? Did the churches see the bridge as a desirable project, or were they, campaigning against it in some sense?
That's a very good question. In terms of outright campaigning, I'm not sure. Certainly from looking through the parish papers, you were certainly concerned about the effect on the individual lives and livelihoods of his parishioners.
We might not have any more concrete documentary evidence, but he was certainly sympathetic to the displaced people.
Yes.
All right. I've
just got the cost. So yes. It was £6.25 million at the time, which was more than $500 million in today's money.
Yep, not loose change. All right, I think we're going to have to end it there. There are more questions, but we've just run out of time. So it just remains for me to thank each of our panel speakers so very much for giving up your time and sharing your expertise with us. And thank you too to all of you out in the audience. I hope you've enjoyed the session and learned a little bit. I certainly have a much broader appreciation for the bridge now than I did before we started this. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, State Library.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Julie.
Yep.